Welcome to the broadcast. This evening we're at Rockefeller University for a conversation about the greatest minds of the 20th century. It is an ongoing conversation that we're having about people and ideas that have been so influential in this century. As you know, Time magazine is in the process of selecting one person who's been the most influential person of this century. That will take place later. They have, in cooperation with others, been looking at different areas of American life and life around the world in terms of business, in terms of politics, in terms of revolutionaries, in terms of entertainers, and in terms of arts. We have, as I said, assembled a very, very distinguished panel here, and you will hear from them throughout this program. They include Peter Gay, Emeritus Professor of History at Yale University, one of America's most distinguished cultural historians. Also here, Maxine Singer, President of the Carnegie Institute. Also here, Steven Pinker, cognitive scientist, director of the McDonald-Pew Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at MIT. Also here, Dr. Robert C. Gallo, director, Institute of Human Virology, and professor of medicine, microbiology, and immunology, School of Medicine, University of Maryland. I got it all out. Also here, Bruce Sterling. He's one of America's best-known science fiction writers and was perhaps the sharpest observer of our media culture, working today in any genre. Also here, Daniel Dennett, Distinguished Arts and Science Professor, Center for Cognitive Studies, Tufts University. Professor Dennett is the author of Consciousness Explained and Darwin's Dangerous Idea. Those are some of the people here who participate. Later we will talk about ideas that they have in a whole variety of areas. What I would like to do as we begin this program is to go around this panel and give a sense of how they think we ought to measure influence and contribution. What is the quality that we're looking for as we explore these various areas? I'll do that by beginning with Maxine. What ought to be the test? That's what happens when you're the lone female in a group.
Okay, all right. I defined for myself a list of things when I was asked to think about the people who'd made the biggest difference in the century. And for me, it came down to four things. First of all, the person had to be associated with the development of a truly original way of looking at something about the world or the universe or the people in it. It had to be different from what anybody had thought before. Second of all, for me, it's important that that idea turns out to be valid. A lot of people think wonderful thoughts, but they turn out to be wrong, and so I don't give them a lot of credit.
So we're going to separate those who are wrong from those who are right.
Right. For me, anyway, it has to be valid. The third thing is that I think the concept cannot be immoral. I don't require that it be moral, but I do require that it not be immoral. So in terms of thinking about the century, I would eliminate Hitler as a grotesque example. And finally, I think the idea has to make a fundamental difference in the way most people on our planet think about themselves or the place they live.
Dr. Gallo?
I couldn't have been spoken any better.
That's why I went to her first.
Yeah, I can't. What can I say? So
anything that
short,
we should add to the way we think about these categories and these people?
Perhaps the only slight difference I would say from Maxine is that I'm not sure it would have to be that no one thought of it before. That'd be hard to prove. But the main thing to me would be that it have to be original in the constraints that the person had, and that it had a long-lasting and major impact. The person who makes the major impact is best documented, with the most originality in the constraints that person faced at the time in a positive way would be the tops on my list.
Okay.
If you compare our children to the children 100 years ago, there are things that our children can understand in grade school that those children 100 years ago couldn't even conceive of, had no conception of at all. What a great thinker does is creates a new idea, a new tool for thinking that opens up a whole new set of dimensions. Sometimes the idea is a system of ideas, sometimes it's an actual physical tool of some sort, like a microscope or the computer. But it's expanding the scope of human thought, making new things thinkable and conceivable.
I think a great thinker has to explain something. When you hear about the idea, you have to think, oh, so that's how it works.
Yeah.
So How do earthquakes work? Well, there are two plates in the earth and one slips by the other, and suddenly we think about an everyday phenomenon in a completely different way.
What should we add to the
the
way we go about the measurement?
My only disagreement would be on the fact that the ideas have been accepted. It may very well be that they're still quite controversial. And there are several people, I think, whom we may want to have on the list who are, in fact, not yet completely accepted.
Great.
So that, beyond that, I have no argument
Right.
with
Bruce?
Maxine.
Well, I'm really glad the 20th century is over.
Why?
Well, I think it was a bad century in a lot of ways, and I think we were lucky to survive it. So I give a lot more credit to the role of evil than I think Maxine does. I think evil has been a very important thing in the 20th century. But
you would not apply a moral dimension to the choice of the most influential thinker?
Yeah, I think there is such a thing as bad influence, and I think there's such a thing as bad scientists. I mean, there are scientists who are incompetent, and then there are scientists who are actively malevolent. And I don't think, and I think their malevolence can be very, very effective and important. But in ranking what makes them interesting or important 20th century figures, I would have to say it would have to be people who made the 20th century different from other centuries.
Walter?
I think when you look at this century, you have to say, what were the amazing things that happened that 100, 200 years from now we'll say, oh, that was the 20th century. First of all was the splitting of the atom and the things that came from that. Also, the notion that there's a universe beyond our galaxy and that universe is expanding. That's a great discovery of the century. The conquest of infectious diseases, with penicillin and things like that. That's another thing of the century. Turning silicon into computing power. That was another great advance of the century. So I would approach it by looking at what were the amazing things that happened in this century and how do we personalize it to see what minds went behind it.
Let me begin by talking about inventors. We're talking, Walter mentioned Silicon Valley, computers and electronics, aviators, astronomy, and space science. Who wants to have out the notion of who within that category? I know, Walter, your magazine has devoted covers to people within that area. Anyone to jump in and tell me who they think ought to be at the top of that list in the 20th century?
I'd say Turing, Alan Turing, a British mathematician who, as much as anybody, can be credited with inventing the computer. And the reason I choose him over, say, John von Neumann, who also took those ideas and helped to make the first actual physical computer, is that before Turing, the idea was really vague. It was hardly in the air at all, and it was his brilliant insight into the possibility of a machine that could read instructions and could become the perfect mimic, could be any other imaginable machine. You can have on your desk now a universal Turing machine. It can do anything that any computer can do. All you have to do is feed it the right program. That is a stunning idea, and it's all his.
Would you have said that 15 years ago?
I would have.
You
yes.
would have. Because we now understand the potential so much more than we ever have. Yeah. Okay, now here is the point we have to make, is that there must be, everybody's saying, how can you compare one with the other, and how do you compare that with Einstein? We understand this is not a perfect mechanism, and we understand that you can find fault with the process that we're engaged in here, and that no, perhaps, considered group would ever suggest that there's only one person that has to be right. But for purposes of engagement, I do want to make these comparisons. Is that persuasive with you, that in fact Hubble is every bit as important?
Pretty much so, although actually I have another candidate myself,
All right.
and that's Marconi. If you look at the previous age of the planet, never until the 20th century was it the air filled with electromagnetic radiation. If we could see it, we would see that the atmosphere was a different color. It was a mosaic of... there was no bigger change, in a way, in the environment of this planet than electromagnetic radiation. And it started at the beginning of the century, and now it's beaming out this ball of radio transmissions and television transmissions is going out into the universe, all those I Love Lucy shows and so forth,
yes.
vanishing into the galaxy. And for a big change, for a change that changed the whole geography, the functional geography of the planet, I think electromagnetic radiation, radio broadcast has got to be it.
Let me turn to scientists in the interest of time, leading scientists. these are not neat classifications. In the world of physics, it seems to me this is an obvious answer, but in the world of physics, who is the most influential scientist of the century?
Can we take a chance?
Yeah, take your chance. All right, class. See, I've always wanted to do this, to take a group of brilliant
Can his
people
name begin with
and
an A
say,
first?
yeah.
Yes.
Some call him Al for short, but
Yeah.
no.
Big Al.
Einstein is clearly. I go back.
Big Al.
Big Al is the guy, isn't he?
That was
Right.
the Big Al.
Right.
You know, but just for a general audience, what was so powerful about Einstein? What made him an obvious choice, perhaps on anybody's list, as the most influential scientist?
One of the things he did is he changed what common sense is.
Yeah.
Before Einstein, we all had our sort of seat of the pants sense of what common sense told us. And we knew that science sometimes adjusted common sense and gave us a new idea. Einstein just blew that right out of the water. He gave us a way of thinking which was so counterintuitive at first that people just didn't know what to make of it. And it's taken most of the century to get our heads around this set of ideas that he introduced. And it's changed the very sort of ground you'd try to stand on when you think, how do I think rationally about a topic? Because he gave us an example which simply overthrew something that had been around for thousands of years, a way of thinking about time and space. And he taught us that was wrong. It's stunning.
What do we know about Einstein that gave him the capacity to make that leap forward? I mean, are we just talking about pure intelligence, or is there something else that in the makeup?
Maybe you take what he said, that he kept as he developed intelligently, he kept the curiosity of the baby, of the child. When asked, at least that's what I've read.
So as brilliant as you are, you have to ask basic questions. Yes?
That's what he said. I suspect his IQ mattered too.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that's brilliant.
But
Yes.
any way you can define, it's been tried. Genius. I know it's a very easy word to use. For him, it works.
Genius.
Yes. Looking at things naively, if you wish, and coming up with answers which seemed unthinkable, impossible, and he took them, and they were right. After all, there was a good deal of empirical verification of what he came up with in his papers. Even the atomic bomb is a distant relative of Einstein as well.
Right.
Two things. Several of the things we talked about before, electromagnetic waves, the atomic bomb, many things go back to Einstein. This is one of the reasons why he stands out head and shoulders above the others. But it's also interesting, the trajectory he took is interesting. He was not very successful in school. He failed. He actually, I think, got thrown out of one school.
You just gave inspiration to thousands of people
And
around the world.
And he finally made it through school, and he did okay, but he didn't do brilliantly. He couldn't get a good job, so he took this lousy job in a patent office. And at night and weekends, he developed these extraordinary ideas, all of which he did before he was 30 years old, both theories of relativity. And the fact of the matter is, he didn't do a heck of a lot after that.
After he was 30, after he did the theory of relativity, that was it. That was it for him in physics. Yeah.
So it's a really interesting way of looking at a very particular mind. And so in focusing on minds, he's kind of a quintessential example of that.
Great point. Yes?
He was also one of history's great nonverbal thinkers. He was a late talker. He wasn't a terribly good writer for such a brilliant man. And a lot of his insights came from very simple thought experiments that you can do in your own head. You're in an elevator, someone cuts the cable, the elevator is plummeting, you take a penny out of your pocket and you drop it, and the penny floats, it's falling with you. What does that say about the relationship of motion and gravity? You're riding on a beam of light, and you look back at the clock on City Hall. Because the reflection of the light from the hands of the clock are moving with you, the clock hands aren't moving. What does that say about time and motion? And he claimed that all of his insights came to him in visual or motor images, and only later did he struggle to put them into words. Of course, he did much better putting them into the language of mathematics.
Yes.
But the German language didn't do him any good.
All right, let me move, because we're going to come back and have a general discussion of some of these, to the world of biology and chemistry. Who should we point to in biology and chemistry?
Back and forth. I mean, there are several of us. Any direction you want.
Okay, go. Biology and chemistry.
Well, I think Francis Crick and James Watson come immediately to mind. There's a lot of other interesting things, and I could mention other people, but there, right at the middle of the century in 1953, they changed everything about biology because now we are able to understand the tremendous variety of living things, all in terms of one molecule that works one way in all living things. And from that, we have gene splicing, we have genome projects, we have a whole variety of things. We have some of the things that President Levine talked about before, and it just changed everything for biology. And one could go into a lot of detail, but that's what I would say.
You could also argue, I assume, in terms of that discovery, it is just in terms of its implications, just beginning, as it is with, say, with the computer and with the internet, just beginning to understand the profound impact it will have in the next century. We may very well come back at the end of the next century and say what's been the most profound idea, and it is the implications of genetics and the implications of DNA and the structure. You want to add to that,
I'd say
Bob?
the same thing as Maxine. We had a chance to talk a bit before, so we both had a number of other names, but in the end, these are the guys whose contribution kind of symbolizes genetics and where things are going to be going. We could name in this institution, Avery, discovered that DNA is the stuff of the genes. Right. One could discuss, Maxine brought up Morgan.
Thomas Hunt Morgan.
Now, who was Thomas Hunt Morgan?
He was a geneticist. He became a geneticist early in the century, right after the Mendel experiments were discovered. And he, using flies, was the person who showed that genes lie on chromosomes and showed many other things about the way chromosomes behave. So the whole notion of the chromosomal theory of inheritance is Morgan. The whole ability to map genes on chromosomes is Morgan. The understanding that what they were doing in flies could also be done, immediately referred to corn or humans or whatever. That was also clear. So Morgan was a towering figure who, again, like Einstein, that work was done in about 6 years.
It's amazing. And the other thing that's powerful about when you think about Watson and Crick is that they're both still alive.
Right.
You know, and it wasn't that long ago. When was the double helix published, for example? Or was it, what, 1960-something?
53.
53,
Right.
yeah. So we're talking about 46 years ago.
I remember I was a second-year graduate student. My whole world changed in one day.
Explain what you mean.
Every way that I thought about biology and biochemistry on one day was different the day after I read that paper.
Wow.
And no question.
Yeah.
I mean, even as a relatively naive student, it was clear.
Yes.
I think biology has my candidate for the worst scientist of the 20th century. That would be Trofim Lysenko, who I take to be the father of political correctness in science. And he was a Stalinist and an ardent Marxist, but mostly he was a purge master, and he disagreed with Darwin's theories because he felt that they didn't fit the doctrines of dialectical materialism. So he had all these mad schemes. He thought, for instance, that since there was going to be a new Soviet man, there might as well be a new Soviet wheat, and that you could somehow turn wheat into barley through actions of forced evolution, which would have been comic if it were not for the fact that anybody who challenged him was sent to the Gulag. So, you know, if you see that, you know, the tremendous contributions of Russia, you know, they had the hydrogen bomb in short order. They had an extremely impressive space exploration program. But I think that the 20th century really robbed us of the fruits of Russian genius. If you can imagine Russia as like a kindly Swedish-style social democracy with development from the World Bank, the 20th century would have been far, far more advanced in science and technology than it is today. And if you have to lay that failing at the feet of one man, it's going to be this Lysenko guy. You know? He's it.
I mean, how many people on this panel knew about Lysenko?
We all know. We all know. Most of us repress it.
Everybody what?
Everybody's villain.
Everybody. It's his favorite villain of everybody?
In
Well, we repress it. We repress it.
He
cultivates it.
won that title, Lysenko. He deserves his villainy.
So there's a consensus the worst villain of the 20th century might be in
The
terms
worst
of
science.
Science.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Right.
what it
No,
is.
I'm not
The guy who did
excusing
the most to
Hitler.
set 20th century science back. he had the worst malign impact on scientific progress.
Okay, so we made your point that we have to point out who is evil as well as those people who make positive contribution. Within the category of evil, he's number one.
And he was a biologist.
Right. Let me, speaking of categories, how about anthropology? Who should we talk about in terms of anthropology?
I would say Franz Boas, who trained the great anthropologists and the not-so-great anthropologists of the 20th century, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Arthur Kroeber, Edward Sapir, who changed our view of language, who really opened up the science of language and connected it to thought. Boas was one of the ones who set people out to study foreign cultures and to reflect back on human nature. And the idea that social institutions could change because what we have with us is not the only way that you can organize a society largely came from him and the people that he trained who showed how things could be different elsewhere.
The trouble with Boas, though, is that he also did perhaps more than anybody else in anthropology to create the split that we have today in anthropology between cultural anthropology and physical, as it were, evolutionary anthropology. And that's one of the most unfortunate divides in all of science, where you have cultural anthropologists who almost make a fetish of not knowing any biology and not wanting to know any biology, not wanting to have anything to do with evolution. And I think that's really unfortunate. That's in the social sciences. That's one of the worst blockades to understanding that we have at the end of the century.
I completely agree, and indeed, one of his students, Margaret Mead, probably the most famous anthropologist, really set knowledge spectacularly backwards by her misreporting of what it was like in New Guinea and Samoa. That she spent a few weeks with some bored teenagers, didn't really speak the language, came away with conclusions that were spectacularly wrong. She referred to the gentle Arapesh. It turns out the men were headhunters. She talked about a sex-reverse culture where the men wore makeup. It turned out that it was war paint that they were entitled to wear after they killed the first enemy. So there's no doubt that the influence was big, but certainly many of the actual claims were unfortunate.
What about the Leakey family?
Absolutely. Richard, Mary, Lewis, and now Maeve Leakey have rewritten our understanding of where our own species came from. So they would deserve to be there.
They would deserve to be there, but would they, in comparison?
In terms of impact, some of the great finds can be attributed to those four. And also, of course, Louis Leakey trained three of the great primatologists of the century. Birute Galdikas, who studies orangutans, Diane Fossey studied the mountain gorilla, and Jane Goodall studied the chimpanzee, all of them students of his.
I don't think we ought to skip Linus Pauling.
All right. Make the case.
Pauling fundamentally changed the way people think about materials. So everything that's around us, including our own bodies, are made of molecules which, until Pauling came along, we couldn't really understand how they were put together. And so what he basically did was to explain to us how bonds are made between different atoms, which allows the building of an infinite number of different molecules, and that in turn has allowed the synthesis of new materials, plastics, nylons. It's allowed the synthesis of drugs. It's allowed a fundamental understanding of the way molecules are built, to the point that these days we're beginning to understand how huge molecules like various proteins are put together. And this was the contribution of Pauling. It was his alone in many respects. And so I think he belongs with the people we've talked about.
That this contribution was a mind tool. And it started out in the classroom. He had these ping pong ball models, and he taught us a whole new way to think spatially, to think in 3 dimensions about these molecules. And this classroom trick turned out to be one of the great advances in conceptualization of the century. In general, I think great thinkers have more ideas than good ideas, and they are not the best judge of which their good ideas are. And late in their career, They don't have to talk about the good ideas. Everybody's already accepted them, so they become self-caricatures.
Right.
They're left hammering away on the few ideas that they were never right about in the first place.
Do we? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, he's true.
Yeah. Now, anybody else in chemistry? I want to give chemistry its due. Walter, Bruce, anybody that want to come back to chemistry before we?
I'd throw in a few mentions for Ilya Prigozhin. He was a Nobel Prize-winning chemist.
How do you know all these people?
I'm a groupie, you know. I'm a science groupie.
Yeah.
Anyway, and he does happen to teach in my hometown, so there's sort of a bit of Texan chauvinism there. But no, he's a Belgian statistical chemist, statistical physicist. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he's written these books, which I have struggled to read repeatedly from being to becoming. They're sort of majestic. I don't think I've ever quite grasped them. But he's basically interested in chemical structures or biological structures out of equilibrium. Yeah. Not the sort of standard, ping pong ball style billiard ball physics, but things where there's more energy flowing in and there are transformations into a higher order of complexity. And I suspect that the 21st century will think very kindly of this man. I don't think that he has had that much of an influence now, but I think when the next century sums up what was important developments in our own time, my suspicion is that he will be seen as a pioneer.
He'll be very lucky if that happens, I think, because he is a classic case of somebody whose ideas have been taken up by people that don't understand them. I mean, there's this new wave cult around Prigozhin's ideas, and I can't get through that. I can't find the real Prigozhin, if there is one in there.
There are new age cults around quantum physics and new age cults around relativity. I mean,
he's a particularly bad case of that, though. I mean, he has not succeeded in getting really clear versions of his ideas out there safe from the cultists, and he's in danger of being swallowed up
from the cultists. There is no safety from the cultists.
That's a fool's errand, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Let me ask this, which is off the beaten path for a second. Of all the scientists that you have read, who was, in your judgment, the most brilliant writer, the person whose command of language you would least recognize at this point, wherever they came from?
I would throw in James Watson, because it was so influential, popularizing the notion of genetics and DNA through the book, The Double Helix, that's filled with wonderful anecdotes and character studies and jealousies and rivalries and makes science come alive. And those of us who read that book, when we were young in school, it made science seem like as exciting of a profession as it could be.
Does it not matter that some of those stories weren't true?
You're getting into the definition of great writing that I'm not sure we can deal with.
Some of the stories in the Double Helix weren't true. Yeah?
Not quite true.
Not quite true.
I would Francois Jacob.
Jacob.
A statue within a book about how he sees science and the philosophy of science.
Yeah.
He's also made great contributions in the area of genetics that we were talking about before and regulation. Yeah. But fantastic writer.
Fantastic writer. Okay.
No, I just wanted to say it was not a very generous book. Because he left out Rose Franklin, and who never did get her share of the fame that she deserved in this whole picture. We always talk about two people, not three, and it was good writing, but
everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Not with his help.
Yeah.
I would add Richard Dawkins, who I think got the ultimate compliment for a science writer, where one reviewer said, he makes the reader feel like a genius. There's no flowery prose, but he took ideas that previously had been expressed only in mathematical equations, and just using sharply chosen metaphors got people to understand very complicated biological processes.
How about Feynman, Richard Feynman?
Richard Feynman, exactly.
Another Feynman.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah. Just in terms of a personality and a presence and a lifestyle and a sense of curiosity.
I love to read when he writes.
Yeah, one of the great things about Feynman, too, is he's completely open about how he thinks. I think a lot of people have the sense that geniuses, Einsteins, they think in an entirely different way from the rest of us. And what Feynman was brilliant at showing was, no, he just has this wonderful bag of tricks, and he reveals his tricks to us, and you read Feynman and you think, oh boy, maybe I could think like that too. I just have to use those tricks the way he does.
And even to the space disaster, you saw an application in a different way, of a capacity to communicate and to explore in a different area. I want to move to behavior in medicine, but there's one other category, geology and environment. This is not an area that I know very much about. Did anyone want to make a contribution of someone that we ought to take note of in the world of geology and the environment?
Rachel Carson.
Of course, as a writer. Yeah.
Both as a writer and as a thinker, helped bring the environment, make it real to us as an issue for this century.
Right. Anyone else?
Alfred Wegener. He's a lost soul, this guy. He came up with the notion of continental drift and was sort of dismissed out of hand, never received any credit for it. And there's no Nobel for geology, so there's never been a lot of focused attention paid on continental drift. But that was a 20th century discovery, and I think that just revolutionized our understanding of the planet. It's like part one in a geology. Continents move.
Yeah.
You know, it astounds me to think that, my grandfather didn't know that. No, it's good solid earth and it's always been here. It's skimming on a scum of lava. It's just an astounding thing.
Maxine, let me go to behavior then. Peter, Freud.
Talking about changing the way people think.
Right.
Even those who don't know anything about him use his language. We are speaking Freud all the time. He's been under very heavy attack. My own guess, and it's only a guess, and I won't be around to know whether I'm right or wrong, that in the next century, his fundamental ideas will remain quite acceptable, even if, for example, the therapy of psychoanalysis may very well give way to something else, medication and so on. We don't know that yet. Great claims are made very quickly in this country, as you know, and we read about them in the New York Times science section. But if you follow, let's say, Dan Goleman, who writes about Freud and related people, you discover that in the space of 6 months, he's all over the place, as other people making their claims. I think the fundamental notions about the unconscious, the power of the drives, the nature of self-control, as in repression and so on, will, I think, stand up. And I believe that a lot of psychologists now, even though they're not taken with him for many reasons, one of which is that there were no rats he could chase around and nothing he could really count, are beginning, I think, if you look at ordinary textbooks, to appreciate these fundamental ideas. I might say, by the way, one other thing that's not very widely known, that one of the very last words that he wrote in London, in exile, and when he was 82 years old, was a little book he didn't live to finish, called An Outline of Psychoanalysis, in which he has a paragraph in which he says, the day will very likely come when we will find certain chemical agents, medication and so on, that will change people's minds for the better permanently. He didn't mean making them drunk or giving them extra energy, but literally changing their minds. And he argued also that in that case, as he put it, psychoanalysis, expensive, uncertain, and all that, will have to be given up as a therapy. So he, at a very advanced stage, was aware that this doesn't touch on his fundamental ideas, but that the technique might very well be given up one of these days. There have been so many obituaries written about him that I think I feel quite content that it really won't be necessary to write that obituary.
There's no doubt that Freud is one of the great minds of the 20th century, and there's no doubt that he influenced the way we talk about people in general. When we say, my roommate is anal because he arranges his pencils, we are alluding to Freud. But he did make claims that were really quite preposterous and could be tested, have not been tested, and would almost certainly be false. I mean, the idea that little boys want to copulate with their mother, that they're afraid of being castrated by their father, the idea that toilet training and breastfeeding can affect your personality for the rest of your life, the idea that there are no errors or slips of the tongue that come from random processes, but that they're all motivated. These are quite extraordinary claims, and at the time that Freud made them, you could perhaps get away with making provocative and counterintuitive statements about the mind. But the whole direction of the study of the mind in the 20th century is, well, if you're making an amazing claim like that, where's the evidence? You could do studies by looking at how children are toilet trained and then following them up 20 years later to see if it affects their personality. Freud and no one else has really done them, and the reason that no one's done them is there's no reason to believe that they'll be true.
I don't quite see that. I don't think that the Oedipus complex, for example, which has been ridiculed so much, doesn't mean that the little boy wants to sleep with his mother. He wouldn't know how to do it, even if he wanted to do it. It's really a generalization about feelings, mixed feelings about one's parents. So I'm not terribly worried about that as something that hasn't been shown to be true or, for that matter, false. It's, you know, psychoanalysis has one particular characteristic that makes other psychologists nervous. It's by nature a deep psychology, which does not, of course, lend itself easily to proof or disproof. I know that philosophers have argued if that's the case, it's, you know, without value. But I think that in part the difficulties have to do with the fact that it's difficult, that he went into areas that other people had set aside as unthinkable, undoable, and so on.
Medicine.
Medicine, I think we could stay for a moment, if I can have a couple of names to suggest, with the genetics part of medicine. Okay. Going back to Pauling, he contributed to our first understanding of molecular disease with the structure of protein, sickle cell anemia. A man that's often forgotten, Archibald Garrod, was the first one really to put genetics into biochemistry or talk about it into such terms, metabolic diseases being genetic origin. To jump to Walter's criteria of things that had obvious impact, if we don't just get into how deep was the contribution, it's impossible to ignore Fleming, but I can't say Fleming without Fleury, because I think antibiotics and everything around them have made
Fleming, penicillin. And
right. And I think in all of science, medical science, we'd have to say immunology is one of the queens and dominating in a lot of spheres and applications in a lot of areas. And I think if we picked a name or two in immunology, we'd have to consider Sir Macfarlane Burnet from Australia, who gave us many of the concepts that we now take for granted in immunology, perhaps more than anyone else. And last and not least, but first, in my mind, and one of the stimulate to me to get into medicine, and he covered not only immunology but other areas, and that's Paul Ehrlich from Germany, where there's an institute named after him. Paul Ehrlich discovered antibodies, started immunology in a sense, and in this century was the father also of pharmaceutical chemistry, having the first drugs attacking diseases. In addition, he laid out the concepts of what we call ligand receptors back in the early part of the century.
This may be already apparent in what you just said, but what's the most powerful discovery, not person, in the area of medicine?
Oh boy, I didn't prepare for this one.
So many.
I mean, you got
antibiotics.
No, I wouldn't say penicillin.
You wouldn't say penicillin. What would you say?
I think that
Maxine?
drugs can have that you can do something about disease therapeutically. What Ehrlich set out to do with ideas and empiricism has to be matched among the top one or two. I can't think of anything I would say beyond that.
Well, I would say immunology, because it is critical to medical therapies, to understanding the progress of disease. Vaccines are essentially the chemicals that we use to replace or to put in place immunological molecules in human beings. Immunology has also given us tremendous insight into the variety of ways that genomes can encode proteins. And it's very possible, or I should at least say that there's a significant amount of speculation at the present moment that it could be that some of the problems in neurobiology, which Steve was talking about, some of these mysteries as to how this brain gets to do all these different things and make all these beautiful connections, may in fact be a mirror image of or have very strong similarities to the way the immune system works. So these are
back to Ehrlich again.
So I would say immunology is really important, and either Ehrlich or Macfarlane Burnet.
But Ehrlich for two or three things. So for me, he's one of the candidates for the whole ball of wax.
This is a locker room question for me, then back on in the area of medicine. What is the next great thing in medicine?
Oh, I suppose, again, it's right off the cuff, I suppose that the answer for most of us will probably be that with the understanding of the human genome, the applications people are believing will be endless, and so that there will be able to be plotted corrections of some abnormalities as we understand their pathogenesis. I think in the immediate future, there will be a tremendous subspecialty of medicine related to what we call cytokines, these local hormones that govern how cells signal each other and talk to each other. And I think that a big wave is just beginning now in applications in medicine related to these molecules, and that there'll be entire subspecialties of medicine around it. But when you think of something that is more broad, a broader concept, I think it'll be the product of the human genome. And where it will take us, no one can really predict
Most
yet.
people agree with that. I mean,
I would say something else. I think that 100 years from now, and perhaps significantly sooner, each of us will be treated as an individual for a disease. We know that we take the same drugs, and they don't always have the same effect on all of us. They cure some of us of a headache and have no effect on some others. And I think one of the things that the Genome Project will allow will be a level of sophistication so that drugs can be designed and courses of drugs can be designed and therapies can be designed for individuals, because we're each different in our genes and other things and respond differently to therapies. And I think that this individualization of medicine is going to be a true revolution in the way we think about medical care. And for me, that's the big thing.
It would come out of the genome study, probably.
It would depend on it.
Yeah,
right.
It would depend on it.
I would wonder whether developmental biology is going to make huge contributions. We still don't know how a ball of identical cells in a couple of months...
What's developmental biology?
Oh, how organisms form from conception.
Right.
So you start off with a ball of identical cells. A few months later, it's got arms and legs and eyes and a heart and so on. I think it's one of the great frontiers of science. And if we really understood it, who knows, we might be able to do things like regenerate parts of the brain that are lost to stroke, or even, in principle, grow artificial organs, grow a heart in a mold. That's one of the ideas that's been put out there. Who knows whether it will happen.
Let me just open this up. We don't have much time remaining, and I want to do a couple of things here before we go. One is to sort of say, is there some other area in terms of philosophy or math or economics that we ought to sort of recognize here in a general way? Walter, you may have some ideas about this or not, in the sense of if we miss somebody that we haven't come across because of my two neat little categorizations as I've walked through science.
If we expanded a little bit from science to just great minds,
yeah.
You have economists like John Maynard Keynes who changed the way we think, and on the other side of Friedrich von Hayek, who, was the opposite approach. But we looked at the economy as one big macroeconomy that we could tinker with. In terms of philosophy, Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, and I know that Dan is...
I've been waiting to say a word. Waiting to say a few words about philosophy, my field. At the beginning of the century, there was a beautiful dream about what could happen with logic and mathematics. It could all be put on a single foundation, and you could just grow by mathematical proof all of mathematics and maybe all of meaning. And this idea, which in some of its guises was called logical atomism, was really the same vision as we already had triumphant in chemistry and physics, the idea that you could take all matter and reduce it to its fundamental atoms. And early in the century, two Englishmen, Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, produced this majestic two-volume Principia Mathematica, which attempted to do just that. And the mathematician Hilbert had a program which had as its end result proving everything provable all in one big system. Several things happened. One, Kurt Gödel came along with a famous proof that this just couldn't be done. This is Gödel's incompleteness proof, which showed that any system you had, and this was one of the few really important limitative results we've ever had on human knowledge. He showed that any system you had, any logical system that was powerful enough to be interesting, had one of two properties. Either it was inconsistent, and that meant that you didn't want what you got, or it was incomplete, which means you couldn't get what you wanted. You're stuck between these two options, and there's no way out of it.
Yeah.
Now, this in turn led Turing to his brilliant work, which led to the creation of the computer.
Right.
And meanwhile, in my field of philosophy, there's one figure, Ludwig Wittgenstein, the Austrian philosopher who moved to England, and then he worked with Russell. He had the dream of creating the perfect logical language for capturing all meaning, wrote a brilliant book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which people thought, hey, he'd done it. He'd solved, the philosophy was over. He went back to Austria to teach. Then he thought about it a bit, and he decided he was all wrong. He came back, devoted the rest of his life to a completely different approach to thinking. And I think this really is one of the great results in sort of pure thought in this century. What he said is, back to the rough ground. Give up the dream of a sort of a mechanical machine where you just turn the crank. You don't have to think anymore. It's just going to fall out. It's not that way. Thinking in every science is not reducible to formula. And that is one of the great ideas of the 20th century. The dream before then was that maybe someday we wouldn't have to think anymore. And Russell and Wittgenstein showed that that's not the case.
We didn't say anything about cancer at all.
Speak to it then.
Well, I just say, I think probably we should say something about, most people would predict that a number of cancers, if not the majority of them, will probably be solved in this century.
Because we understand the chemical mechanism that produces cancer.
And how cells grow, divide, and you brought up development, differentiate. These things,
the aberration and all that.
They'll come together, and it would be disappointing if in the first half of the century.
It'd be disappointing if in the
first half of the century a number of cancers weren't eliminated or understood well.
Well, are we talking about the first 25 years, though, maybe, rather than the first?
I think some are doable in the first 25 years.
Some of it may be genetics, too?
Some cancers obviously involve inborn tendency to that cancer, and will be genetics.
And understanding the whole genome.
I just want to get back to philosophy. I would agree with you with what you said about those two. And Gödel is very important, but very special. And I had a whole list of other philosophers whom I think we might think of, but one seems to be quite obvious, especially in this country, would be John Dewey. His emphasis, not always, felicitous, his importance in education, the fact that he wrote about politics, religion, reconstruction, philosophy. I think he was a very important figure, and interestingly enough, he's being now rediscovered by other philosophers, and I think he belongs on that list. And just very briefly, it seems to me that there are two other people, one of whom is likely to be almost unknown here. But the discipline of history, which I'm a representative, does, I think, deserve some recognition here. There were great minds, and I would be willing to offer just one example. Marc Bloch, a French medievalist who essentially changed the way in which the profession thinks about what even to look for, what to think about. I mean, he is almost, I'm putting it very strongly, almost the inventor of modern social history. And my second candidate to be added would be a sociologist who has had, most of whose influence has been, as it were, indirect, and that's Max Weber. He would never get any, prizes for stylishness, but his way of thinking of organizations, about of power, politics, bureaucracy, and so on, have been remarkably important, even though a lot of people have never heard of him.
All right, I have two things I have to do here because we're over. One, I mean, with respect to this audience, only because I keep my promises, is anybody who wants to shout out somebody that we are so, that me, not anybody else, have just missed the boat and that I deserve severe reprimand because I didn't mention this person's name. Anybody got an idea? I'm sure. Yes? Heidegger. Niels Bohr. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Carl Jung. Are we all agreeing that, okay, so go ahead. Anybody else?
Vannevar Bush.
Bush.
Yep.
Anybody else? Salk. Obviously, we throw some of these in. Anyone else? Jonas Salk, the last person mentioned. Niels Bohr was mentioned.
If you say Salk, you have to add 3 or 4 more.
You have to add 3 or 4 more, exactly. They've been in others.
And maybe even more than that.
Yeah. And Dr. Gallo and others are very much involved in terms of understanding HIV and that whole scientific investigation continues. Others?
Norman Wiener. Yeah.
Norman Wiener, yes? Mm-hmm. All right. That's why you're here.
Neumann.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
He was uncanny, that guy. Yeah. He really had an unusual mind.
All right. Anyone else?
Sanger's a good one.
Sanger?
Yep.
I had him on my list.
Yeah, it was on your list. All right.
It's in there.
You cannot, and if you, anybody else, one more before I sort of sum this up? Thomas Kuhn. Yes? Bob, don't go to your list now. Before I say a few closing things, I'm going to turn back to Maxine, because I think this is what this has been about. You know, we've talked about politics before, and the contributions of FDR, and the contributions of Churchill, and the contributions of others. You've talked about business, and we've talked about Rockefeller and Gates and Ford and others. You know, we've talked about the world of literature and the world of the arts, and we've talked about Picasso and so many others. A world of people who have made such a significant contribution to who we are and what we appreciate and have affected our lives is too much to consider in any 100 programs. And Time Magazine is doing an extraordinary job of trying to focus on it, and the CBS is doing their part as well in terms of bringing these people alive in a very visual way. Before I leave what we are talking about, I want to ask Maxine and others if you would like to jump in, which is the romance and the joy of science itself. You know, to understand what it is that makes science and all the subjects we've been talking about today, the life of the mind, so compelling for you.
Just your asking the question made me smile, because I like to think about that. I think I've answered this question before, and for me, it's the notion that maybe tomorrow I will know something that no one has ever known before. It may be a rather trivial thing, it may be a big thing, and it may not happen tomorrow, it may be 10 years of tomorrows, but always what drives me, I think, is the notion that I can know something that's just new and fresh and has not been understood before. And that's what, for me, that's it, the romance of it.
Does that sum it up for all of you, what your life is about and what the life of the mind is about?
I think it's also seeing the world in new ways. I mean, it's looking at a piece of wood and thinking, that's just a bunch of straws glued together. It's looking at color and saying, well, that's just waves wiggling at different frequencies. It's looking at someone walking across the room and thinking, that's a remarkable act of balance, that the person is actually continually falling and breaking his fall. And there's nothing that you can look at, I think, if you know science and not see in a different way. It means that you're really never bored.
I think it's an addiction also.
An addiction. Yeah.
I mean, that's the clearest way I can explain it, like the hamster in the cage going around and around.
My thanks to Peter Gay. My thanks to, who, as I said earlier, is the Emeritus Professor of History at Yale, Stephen Pinker, Cognitive Scientist, Director of the McDonald Pugh Center for Cognitive Neuroscience at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Maxine Singer, President of the Carnegie Institution. I also, Bruce Sterling, who is an author. I want to thank David for being here, and so many, Daniel Dennett, and so many people. Like we mentioned, David Ho is in the audience here, and we're at Rockefeller University, a great center for learning and the world of the mind. And lastly, because I may not have introduced him when we began this program, my thanks to Walter Isaacson, the editor of Time Magazine, because it is the spirit of Time Magazine's investigation and exploration of the question of who has vastly and significantly influenced the way we think about ourselves and made a difference in our lives in the past 100 years, which has led to other programs and this program. Walter, thank you very much. My apologies for not mentioning you at the beginning, as I said with these scientists. We thank you for joining us, and to all of the people who made this possible, from Time, from CBS, from my group, from Rockefeller, from Pfizer. Thank you very much. I look forward to doing this again. Good night.